To be a little bit Donald Rumsfeld here, you can have pre-political problems that have pre-political solutions. You can have political problems that have political solutions. But then you can also have pre-political problems that have political solutions and political problems that have pre-political solutions.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le boonga, boonga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le boonga, boonga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le boonga, boonga.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history, and indeed the global pre-political podcast at whatever happens after the end of history.
Nice.
So I'm Alex Hochul. Did I say that? Important to reaffirm one's identity, particularly in these hyper-mediated spaces where it's all flux and you can lose yourself a little bit. Which is maybe a little bit to the point of what we'll be talking about. That other voice you've already heard is George Hoare, of course, co-host of this podcast. I only know him from BungaCast, so if he has other credentials he wishes to mention for himself, because he's a guest today, he's not a co-host.
Yes, I mean, I'm an editor at Damage magazine. I think relevantly to this discussion, also the co-author with Nathan Sperber of Antonio Gramsci, An Introduction to Antonio Gramsci, His Life, Thought and Legacy, which we'll be drawing on a little bit. Other things as well, have other credentials, but I think those are relevant for this evening's. Well, I was going to say this evening, this afternoon, this morning, across different time zones, but it's evening for me. So
very good. And for Amber Trotter, who's joining us again, welcome back. It's morning. Is it a good morning? Good morning to you.
Good morning. So nice to be here.
Yeah, so Amber has been on, I think, last year talking about frozen eggs and frozen neoliberal freedoms. She's a psychologist in private practice in San Francisco, an editor at Damage magazine, and the author of Psychoanalysis as a Subversive Phenomenon. And indeed, we are doing this episode in association with Damage magazine. I mean, all three of us are kind of part of the editorial group. And this is about a specific article and a specific theme in the 5th print issue of the magazine called The Pre-Political. Thinking about the pre-political, I've not inadvertently because I did it deliberately, but in the last 2 BungaCast newsletters, which come out at the end of the month, have written really quite directly about the pre-political. And that not necessarily directly in association with the themes of the content of the latest issue of Damage. But of course, it's something that comes up, and so many of the crises of our times have this pre-political element. If we were just merely dealing with politics, we wouldn't be perhaps at the end of history, but in history proper. So it's something that we always return to. But specifically today, we're talking about George and Amber's excellent article, Overmedicalisation and the Crisis of Authority. So maybe we should just get into that. Although maybe I should offer Amber, because I don't think we got a chance to do this. There were several criticisms made, as well as praise, but I want to talk about the criticism, which is always more interesting, of Amber's last appearance on this podcast, talking about, well, I think she presented a critique of egg freezing as a constant, as a persistent attempt to delay child rearing. And people took this to be a sort of anti-technology position, which I don't think it was. I defended Amber on this count, but maybe Amber would like to offer her own rebuttal to some of these critiques.
Well, not having read them directly, I would say that from what I recall, I was endeavoring to not necessarily critique, but more describe a way in which technology can render us more susceptible to, I think, a very human impulse to keep all our options open, and sometimes therefore foreclose certain kinds of freedoms that come through making decisive choices, through kind of going down one path or the other. And I think that's just human. We want to have our cake and eat it too, and keep keep all the options open, optimize for all possible outcomes. And part of that is risk management, and part of it is just trying to have as much possibility as we can. And I think technology can really turbocharge that sort of impulse, or make it more possible. That said, I do think I have come to be something of a critic of technology, living in the Bay Area and really reckoning with the impact of technology on our lives. I think it enables us to do so many wonderful things, like have this podcast together. But I think we need to take seriously um, some of the darker aspects. So I can own that. I can perhaps own some of that critique.
Yeah, very good. I think we should park that for now. We could actually open up a whole discussion on that, and maybe some of these questions about choosing your freedom or the freedom of choice at a kind of very consumerist sort of level will be a theme that we might return to as we talk about over medicalization. So, firstly, maybe you could just spell out broadly the argument and say why you wanted to write this, because I guess George and Amber, respectively, you come from different perspectives on this. Maybe not necessarily political perspectives, but different intellectual backgrounds, put it that way. And so there's a combination of approaches in this. So maybe you can explain what the argument is.
This is
Sure.
this is difficult to know who goes first, but maybe Amber. Why? Because I actually looked at all the correspondence back and forth. So yeah, why did you want to? So I'm taking the position of host. Why did you want to write an article on this? What were you bringing to it? Because I yeah, maybe you do that, and then I'll do what I was bringing to it, and then we can do the argument.
Sure. I think that my memory is you and I had begun talking a year ago. We had our last summit in New York City about something of a crisis of authority and coming at it from different angles. And you can talk about yours, but from my perspective, I think a lot about authority from the perspective of psychoanalysis and development in childhood. I think psychoanalysis is a lot of things, but it is certainly a theory of how we internalize and reckon with authority, initially through our parents in very early childhood, but that has implications for how we relate to authority going forward in our lives, how successful that sort of process is. And of course, parents, primary caregivers, families, sort of proxy for the broader social order, and our first foray into sort of socialization and the symbolic in the way that we look, let go of, give up a certain measure of freedom, or gratifying our every instinctual drive in the service of living together in some kind of social symbolic order. And we came to the over medicalization piece maybe a bit later. I think there are many different phenomenon through which we could kind of approach this question of authority in the world today. But it's such a striking phenomenon, escalating rates of diagnosis, and one that we're both interested in sociologically, politically, and of course, for me, clinically. So it made sense as a phenomenon to kind of dive into and wonder what's happening here, and could it maybe reflect a sort of breakdown in different forms of authority, perhaps including both political and clinical or professional kind of authorities.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of build on that a little bit, I think that one of the starting points was the kind, if I remember this correctly, your observation that there are different sort of styles of parenting, that might be current in America, but or more widely, but the rise of permissive parenting, like this essential abdication of parental authority, and for an alternative to permissive parenting being like alpha parenting or arsehole parenting. I don't know if you use that second phrase or if that's just an invention of my memory, but this idea that it's quite difficult to construct a model of authoritative parenting. And this kind of, not only resonated with me, but I think also finds its analog in some of this quite knotty question of like, why is it that we see, for example, we in the in the piece we start off with autism rates. So from around like 1 in 10,000, not maybe tracked in the same way in the 70s, to 1 in 22 8-year-olds in California receiving a diagnosis of autism. There's alongside this, at least in the UK, there's a massive increase in adults seeking a diagnosis of ADHD, sort of attention deficit hyperactive disorder, and this is like 400% increase between 2020 and 2023. And it's like, but it's not getting the diagnosis; it's seeking it. So I think there are people clearly looking for the authority that they think is in a diagnosis. There is a kind of, I think everyone's kind of scrabbling around looking for, where is authority? And that, I think, put that next to, there just seemed to be a spate of books. I don't know if 3 is a spate, but it seemed a spate, or it seems to me at this point a spate. Abigail Schreier's Bad Therapy, Suzanne O'Sullivan's The Age of Diagnosis, and Alistair Sandhouse's No More Normal, and they're all on similar sorts of things, which is like, why is it that everyone's talking about mental health diagnoses, not just mental health, but primarily? And this is something which, in the UK at least, has been discussed in the context of what is called the prevalence inflation hypothesis, this idea that perhaps mental health problems have increased as a consequence of quite well publicized efforts to raise awareness about mental health. So there's all these things, I think, going on at the same time. Like, what's going on with kind of parenting? Is this the dominance of the kind of medical model impressing itself on subjects who have no political authority to turn to? I don't actually think that is the case, but all of these things being discussed, you've got to write it out and see what actually is going on.
Well, you've got to, and also you've got to call a spade, haven't you, George? So you talked through
indeed
3 different possible explanations. I think my sense is that I think a lot of people would have a certain skepticism with regard to overdiagnosis and overmedicalization today, at the same time that they might themselves indulge in it, seek it themselves, perhaps, or seek it for their children. And that's not to say that everybody's doing this cynically. I don't think that's the case. In fact, one of the premises of your argument is that people are seeking out diagnosis not just as a kind of get off work card or whatever it might be, something like that, but to be like the very cynical understanding of it, but really want to understand themselves and their place in the world through this. You note, in fact, that people are seeking, or rather operating on a basis of inherent illness today, right? That it's not something to be managed, to be coped with, that maybe it perturbs your life and interferes with things, but you still nevertheless try to get on with things. And it's something which is much more, I think, reading between the lines here, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but connected to identity, right? So the diagnosis is something which is, this is who you are now, not just something that you have. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to be clear that, in my opinion, people's subjective distress is real, and we're not trying to in any way question the veracity of someone's experience of suffering, of distress. But I suppose a general important pre-political question is, how do we make meaning of suffering, of distress? How do we understand our own subjective experience of pain, of suffering? What is the idiom? And we want to make meaning out of our suffering. We want to kind of understand it so that we can address it. And we seem to be understanding more and more of our distress in terms of mental health. And I think there's sort of an interesting question of why. And throughout, time and space, people understand distress in sort of different ways.
Mm-hmm. I think that's compelling. I mean, I agree with that. Though you do note that there are 3 possible explanations for the increase in diagnosis, and I think it's hard not to say, well, it's a bit of all of them. They might place emphasis on different
and
things.
I mean,
So let me just run through them if that's all right.
yeah,
It's required
please
from the
do.
article that you that we've become better, that effectively the microscope is identifying more microbes, right? That we're better now at identifying these things. And if you think about, I mean, you cite how 50 years ago autism was estimated to affect around 1 in 10,000 people. I would probably opt for the hypothesis that, well, autism is much more understood today. So even if it's being overdiagnosed, surely it was underdiagnosed before, right? Or that there's just reduced stigma, and so people are more willing to be diagnosed, to seek out a diagnosis, to be public about their diagnosis, and so on. The second possibility that you note is that we're actually getting sicker, or that effectively big serious illness is less common today, and so we're paying more attention to psychological questions or neurological questions. And then the third one is that we're coming to understand our lives and our struggles in terms of illness, which is more of a, I guess, a constructionist interpretation. And it's probably the one that you most advance here. Though, I mean, maybe playing a bit devil's advocate, because I'm obviously sympathetic to the argument. It's a kind of all of them, isn't it? I mean, the role that mental health plays in contemporary society is a facet of all of these.
Yeah, I mean, just to take mental health specifically, we have got better at detecting because the stigma has decreased. And I think that is important as, I guess, things like heart disease maybe start to affect people less or later, or there are various kind of solutions to some, but not all physical health problems. Yeah, maybe we are getting sicker. But I think it is a really, I mean, that's why I think it's an interesting point to consider, because I think it is very open. Are we, like, how would you empirically measure whether we come to understand more of our struggles as illness or not? I think it seems plausible to me, but maybe that's because I was convinced already. This, as you mentioned earlier, Alex, this idea of like the inherent illness paradigm, this which we talk about in the piece a little bit. This idea that essentially the way we should understand ourselves is that we're always like ill in some way, or something is not perfect. We may touch perfection, which is health, occasionally, if we're lucky, but otherwise there is always something wrong. Like, and I think this is, if you were to run a full set of scans on any like quote unquote healthy adult, they would find various undiagnosed and like actually things which don't really affect that person's life, but they are there. And so the more that we turn our gaze inwards, perhaps it seems like there might be some explanations or some reasons why we sort of do tend to see ourselves as or more as Amber said, this, the struggle, the suffering is real, but the interpretation of it, I think that's where because it's difficult to say whether the amount of suffering goes up or down. I do tend to think, since the improvement of dentistry, the fact that people don't have like chronic tooth pain all the time is a genuine step forward in human. I've said this on the podcast before. Genuine step forward in human, and our species.
Is that a controversial point? Are you getting hate mail because you've made that point?
To the kind of return to pre-dentistry people who are like have an abscess and they're like in pain their entire lives, and they're like, yeah, there's no such thing as human progress.
Touch with reality. Yeah.
This is of course not at all empirical, but anecdotally, I think we have really come to understand mental health and illness much better just over the course of my time working as a psychotherapist. And I, broadly speaking, think that's a good thing. I think it's wonderful. We have more language and more insight and can be more responsive and effective in helping people with all kinds of difficulties. But as our understanding of mental health and illness has sort of ramped up, maybe our sophistication in understanding our distress in other ways has sort of ramped down. And so it's easy to map a lot onto mental health, in part because it's sort of an accepted framework.
Yeah.
I
think
and it's worth adding that the framework has itself become more sophisticated or more complicated or more comprehensive for sure. So in the piece we talk about the DSM, so this kind of Bible of all the things that can be kind of wrong with you from a kind of mental health perspective. And so in 1952 there were 106 diagnoses and it ran to 132 pages, and by 2013 it was 300 plus diagnoses over 947 pages. I mean, that's quite crude, but if you just compare those two like the size of those two manuals, then you can see that in 2013 compared to 1952, there are many more things that this framework suggests could be a problem for people. So I think it is, I mean, and this is, in some ways the common sense or the kind of superficial explanation is of like why we might be seeing more things as in terms of, more of our struggles in terms of illness, is that big pharma have their interests in selling us drugs, and that's not nothing. And also the medical establishment, all those, no offense to anyone who might be in this field, but they've got their frameworks that they're very ready to apply and to say to you, here is what's wrong with you, here is how I can help you with a series of or a kind of you might need some therapy, and by the way, this is going to go on forever and it's not going to solve your problems definitively. So there is this kind of crude materialist, perhaps oversimplification, which is that there are interests that are there in saying to us, maybe consider these problems that you're having in terms of these frameworks.
So I want to help to understand something. Maybe particularly Amber can help with this, because I understand the problems. I agree with your description of the problem with understanding things in terms of inherent illness. I don't think everyone should go around thinking of themselves as ill, and certainly not identifying themselves at one element, one means through which they identify themselves as a subject in society is by saying, I have this illness. Like, I don't think that's good. On the other hand, I think certainly what I've taken from the line of critical theory that has most impacted me, which includes Freud and Lacan, but not exclusive to that, which is about understanding the subject as not whole, not having any fantasies of omnipotence or anything like that, and that we're all kind of damaged subjects in some way, that the pursuit of the perfection of health that George referred to is itself problematic. So where do we stand with this? I mean, if everybody's understanding themselves as ill, isn't that a good thing? Isn't that a step forward relative to some idea of a kind of whole subject, which is, just has no real problems?
Makes me think of the famous Freud's line that the goal of psychoanalysis is to replace neurotic misery with ordinary unhappiness. I think somehow we're missing the concept of ordinary unhappiness. So perhaps it would be good and sort of freeing to accept that the baseline is a certain amount of damage or unhappiness.
Right.
And that's different than neurotic misery, but it's also different than some kind of mythic optimal, we're in the same wonderful mood every day and love all of our coworkers, or, the kinds of notions that seemingly are pursued.
Right, right, indeed, yeah, and I guess it's something I would associate very much with the Californian, not to slight the place where you are, Amber, but to the certain Californian idea, both found amongst the traditional sunny optimism as well as the kind of tech obsession with optimization and self-optimization. But I do want to draw attention to something which I think is one of the most interesting analytic claims in the piece, and I think it's really, I think it's very good, it's well observed, is that a lot of the understandings, I think, when it comes to the discussion about over medicalization, is that it's scientific authority, which is, is on the is run amok. It's just everywhere. Everything is technocracy. All it's the medical scientific establishment, which is running everything, which has replaced elected politicians. They're the ones telling us how to live our lives, and these are the people who are held up on the pedestal. And you argue that no, in fact, what's happening is something different. The pursuit of self-diagnosis, correct me if I'm misinterpreting the piece, but the pursuit of self-diagnosis, or the pursuit of diagnosis, because people aren't diagnosing themselves, but the pursuit of diagnosis, they're going to a doctor and saying, I have ADHD, or my son has ADHD, help them, is a strange amalgam of subjective and purely scientific, as you write in the article. And so it's kind of like, actually, it's scientific authority is in decline, but people are seeking this diagnosis using scientific language, but without really giving up their decision making or whatever to the scientific authority. In fact, it's very much themselves and their atomized self. Can you talk us through this?
Do you want to take this one, Amber? Or I could.
Let's both take a stab. I think we probably both have different kind of angles on this one. I will say again, anecdotally, for myself and talking to many therapists, people come to treatment with their own diagnosis and are looking for affirmation. They're not saying, "What's wrong with me? What do you think?" Much less coming and saying, "Well, I think everything's fine," and looking. And then the mental health professional says, "Well, I disagree with you." No, they're coming in saying, "This is what I've got going on, and I want you to sort of validate that, and you can get in hot water if you don't." Right? Because the ultimate authority is seen as subjective experience, that the source of authority really has become located in the self. And you can see this across a lot of different domains. You see it in education, where the ultimate source of maybe authority in some sense is shifted from the teacher or the curriculum to the student and what they think is right for them or how they learn best or something like this. And I think something we try to suggest in the article is that there's something of a historical progression from a breakdown of more traditional forms of authority, the family, the church, what have you, to upholding scientific authority, the authority of experts, and to living through this moment, progressing from that to this moment where even that has broken down and we're sort of angry at being, I don't know, failed by experts, by science. And so we're turning, like, there's nowhere else to turn besides the self. We've got nothing left to turn to. And we sort of see ourselves as the ultimate authority on what we need, who we are, why we're feeling the way we're feeling.
I mean, I think this is for me the crux of the piece, or more widely than that, the kind of contemporary question about authority. And the penny definitely dropped for me, Amber, when you were saying that, if not putting words in your mouth, but patients were kind of coming to you looking for validation of something which they or an already existing kind of diagnosis or already existing kind of viewpoint, and it is that kind of it's the authority of lived experience, whatever that means in this precise context, which is the real explanation. Because as I said before, superficially it looks like if it is the case that there is overdiagnosis, i.e. that for a given level of severity of symptoms, the level of diagnosis has gone up and it's now quote unquote too high, whatever exactly that means, then at first this looks like it's medical authority that is too strong. We are in this situation in COVID, as George Hoare put it, of a technological sanitationist despotism. And I don't agree with that as much as I would call myself an Agambenite on the whole, overall. I know he got a lot of stick during COVID, but I think on this precise point, it's not right. It isn't the case that we have this kind of authoritarian medical regime straightforwardly. Instead, there is a gap here. There is a void of authority, or the traditional source of authority have I was going to say step back. They have internally decayed or declined, or just the contradictions of them have sunk them. So now you have this situation where it is essentially the medical expert is validating something that's already bought in, already kind of come, already there in the lived experience. So I think that is that kind of, I think it's a paradox. It appears to be that there's too much medical authority, but I think in reality, it's that there isn't really any ability for the practitioner to push back against. This is your area, not mine, of course, Amber, but to push back against somebody already coming in with this diagnosis, say, of ADHD. Well, if you don't validate this, I'll go to someone else, or there'll actually be problems for you if you're not really perceptive enough, or if you're kind of not really listening to what someone's saying when they're saying that this is the particular interpretation that they have of what's going on with them. So I think that there must be something here which needs further explication beyond this article, but that I think is really important for when we're talking about politics or the pre-political, which is that authority doesn't work in exactly the way that we're accustomed to it working, and that there is something kind of a bit paradoxical and a bit slippery going on here.
So I want to turn to this question of authority, because there's a lot to unpick with regard to that, and it's kind of the two halves of the piece are over medicalization and the crisis of authority. But I just wanted to before that ask whether, because there's this tendency, let me put it this way, to say, actually it's not real mental illness, or to try to socialize these like subjective experiences, right? To say, look, it's not you who is anxious and depressed, it's actually the society in which we live. And even, to put in like kind of typical contemporary radical language, like, oh, it's capitalism, or it's capitalism that's making you ill. And you gesture towards this in saying that the constructionist approach that you take mostly, right, which is to say, to cite here, we are coming to understand more of our lives and our struggles in terms of illness, and you problematize this, and that this is tantalizing because it offers, as you say, the prospect that a change in understanding could lead to an actual, perhaps instantaneous improvement in mental health. I used to have mental illness, but I realized it was just capitalism. What are your feelings on this? I mean, where do you stand on this? Is it capitalism?
I don't think capitalism helps. let's put it that way. But I think it's
I don't want to
more.
blame it all on 9/11, but it certainly didn't help.
No, but I mean, this is the thing, that those interpretations, or that, like, the dialect between the between this, the structures and agency, or the objective and subjective, I think is important, because it isn't the case that once you're like, oh, here is this model of capitalism, don't you feel better now? You don't feel depressed or anxious now that you understand commodity fetishism? It's like, well, no, because these structures are still really there. They do have an impact on individuals, and that's how the contemporary subjects are formed. And I guess this is kind of the big question, is like, what sorts of subjects are being created? How do we understand ourselves? And what limitations is that? I don't want to get ahead of ourselves too much. I mean, maybe
and
Amber.
how do we respond, right? I think we respond to distress differently depending on how we understand its cause. It's not like understanding something in more broadly sociopolitical terms relieves the distress instantaneously. But if we take ADHD, for example, if we notice a lot of symptoms of ADHD in ourselves and we think, I have this medical, neurological, mental health disorder, and if I understand it through that lens, then I'm going to seek, let's say, medication. I'm going to seek a stimulant medication so that my brain can function more effectively. We could take the same set of symptoms and interpret it as too much is being asked of me in too many different directions. Combine that with the tendency of the cell phones to make us distracted all the time. That could produce something that looks like ADHD. And that might, lead us to a different kind of treatment, so to speak. Well, maybe we need to engage in political struggle to raise wages or have universal child care so I don't have to juggle so many things, or whatever else you might think of there.
Yeah, I think my kind of crudest response to this, which I think is fundamentally correct, is that the framework that we don't really have access to, or the word that's not really used today that often, is alienation. And this is, like, I think, a very useful, important way to understand here is, like, it's not just, well, it's kind of is just capitalism, but it's not just capitalism. And the fact that it's alienation doesn't mean that everything is okay. It actually says, it gives you higher problems to deal with. But that kind of, I guess, the entire framework of Marxism, which is behind, a simple, your doctor has diagnosed you with alienation, and here is the prescription. But that entire kind of framework is not expanding in the way that the DSM, the American the APA are doing a bit of a better job at kind of growing their framework than the Marxist-Leninists. Let's kind of put it that way. And I think that's the kind of, in some ways, I would say, ultimately what we don't really have as a an aspect of our self-understanding today, is that there is this concept of alienation, and that this could partly explain why we feel anxious, depressed, etc., etc., etc. There are other things which it wouldn't explain, but I think there is a core that it might go quite a long way to explaining that, but we don't really have access to it today, I don't think.
So I want to push against this in a couple of ways. I mean, firstly, I think as we've discussed before on the podcast, George, there's a reason I suspect why alienation was the big thing from the 1950s through to maybe the 90s, and it declined after that. I mean, in terms of as a way of diagnosing social problems, and it might just be that the subject has become too fragmented to even understand itself as alienated, because you need, to some sense, a whole subject who has a part ripped out of them. But if you're too fragmented, you don't really understand yourself as a coherent whole, and that's a whole big discussion about postmodernity and fragmentation and so on, which I don't think we can get into right here. The but what you're suggesting with your talk about alienation, with your talk of alienation, but also with the argument that you make in the article is in some way a political solution to the problem. And I wonder whether politics is not the right answer, or at least that there's a wrong way to think politically with these things. So my question is in two parts. So the first one concerns this idea of capitalism, because I have a big problem with this. Like, capitalism is doing something to us, right? Because it portrays capitalism as an alien form, which lends itself to often quite pre or anti-modern conceptions, right? Like, okay, so if capitalism is this market thing that's going on, which itself is I think, a misleading way to understand what capitalism is. But nevertheless, that if it's this thing that is happening to us or is done to us, then surely the task is merely to remove it, right? Which can only mean going back to some sort of agrarian communitarian past, which is impossible and undesirable. So I have that problem with the capitalism. Capitalism is ultimately a form of society that we create and we reproduce. And indeed, it's through the withholding of labor that is one way in which things can be ground to a halt, and people could take power over the form of society that we have and to transform it. So I have that issue with it. But maybe more pertinently to the article, I wonder if you could explain what the relationship is between two references to authority you make in the article. What you make references to traditional authority, and indeed I think that's in the stand first, and to political authority, because I don't understand these as the same thing. And which one is at issue here, or is it both? You talk about the decline of political authority and the decline of traditional authority, and for me, that's an argument which points in kind of two different directions.
It's a good question, or a double question. Maybe I could have a go at the political and traditional authority one, because that might have been something that I wrote in the article and didn't write that clearly. But I guess which is not referenced in the article as far as I can remember. But Weber writes a lot about authority, charismatic, traditional, rational, legal, and I think these are different sorts. And I think it seems to me that, like, if we're talking about traditional authority today, we're kind of not talking about the way things have always been, the kind of structures of family and kinship, but we're actually talking about a fairly recently, like, disappeared or I was going to say dissolved sort of authority. It seems very difficult even today to sort of say, the whatever the the kind of 20th century forms of authority, of knowledge, of truth were, they seem really to be to have low levels of support. And I think that is probably what was gestured at in terms of traditional authority, and not that kind of more stricter kind of Weberian understanding. But yeah, I guess ultimately, what is political authority? I think there's a phrase, I was going to say coined by, but coined means used when someone else has started it. A phrase invented by, if I remember correctly, Lee Jones, this idea of authoritarianism without authority. That maybe today we do have a very controlled society, but the representatives of our kind of political order do not appear to act authoritatively. So there is something, again, paradoxical with political authority, because if there are low levels of participation in politics, then what do the laws that we collectively make really have on us in terms of a binding requirement to obey them? That's kind of very, very basic question of political theory seems to be much more open than it used to be. Anyway, sorry, I kind of rambled on that. I thought I was going to give a very succinct, short answer and then pass it over to Amber, but that didn't really work out like that.
Amber, do you want to jump in? Otherwise,
Sure. I mean, I think that, gosh, there's a lot to respond to and draw out. It's a good question, Alex. I think, of course, we can't get away from some kind of political authority, but maybe the kind of Gramscian framework of consent, coercion, corruption, like what are the different ways that authority actually happens politically, and what are, maybe the different ways that authority happens developmentally or psychoanalytically. And I think that it's always clunky to try to bridge sort of the personal and the political, or the more psychological theories of authority with the political kind of frameworks of authority. But in psychoanalytic kind of terms, ideally our parents function as kind of good enough authority figures, and they induce us into the social order. And to be a good enough authority figure, and it's a hard thing to do, you don't want to be punitive or vindictive or capricious, but you don't want to be, permissive either. You want to sort of offer, well, here are the kind of rules, and here's what's allowed and not allowed, and it should make some kind of rational and emotional sense as a child develops. And that is a kind of corollary of a consent framework, I think, where at a certain point you're socialized into it and you realize, well, my parents are right about these things, or I understand the reason behind this. And you don't at first. At first, it probably just feels quite upsetting, quite, to the small child to be told, well, no, you can't have access to the breast anymore, whatever other kind of psychoanalytic tropes are out there. But, take, for example, a child who really wants a smartphone and their parents say no, and they're very upset about it when they're young, but then they become an adult and think about their relationship with the smartphone and kind of look back and understand the world from that perspective and think, well, my parents are right about that. And if I had the opportunity to be a parent, I would sort of do the same thing. If like a good enough authority sort of induces us into a social order in a way that we feel decently good about. There's always trade-offs and there's always some amount of repression, but we can kind of get on board and indeed become authority figures ourselves for other people by kind of being inducted into this order. We can then conduct ourselves in a way that we're able to lead a good life or something like this. I don't know.
right.
There's
Yeah.
some
Well, I
kind of
think
bridge there.
I think that phrase "good enough authority" or "good enough authority figure" I think is a really, I think that's exactly it. Like, to kind of, maybe we'll go into this more, but like the idea of the pre-political, that's what it seems to me is like, that's really where it lies. Like, do you have good enough authority figures in terms of, parents or teachers or like adults for the child, both in the family and outside of the family, who are able to, raise the question of rules and, the embodiment of reason as well, and the, to put it in highfalutin terms, the kind of the representation of necessity or limits to action, so that the child is then able to want to and able to and wants to kind of become that authority figure, both individually and perhaps collectively through politics as well. And that's, if you're talking about what is a healthy, if this is a real thing, pre-political society, it's, I think, one that has that where children have that ability to kind of to make that kind of progression. And I think this touches on a lot of things that we talked about with Varn on education. There is this absence today in a lot of fields of that kind of good enough authority figure. It's either abdicated or it's kind of oversold, so that they're, children can't establish that healthy relationship, which is ultimately one of eventually going to be assuming that authority role.
Right. No, I think that's good. I mean, that goes some way to answering what was in part my next question, which is that sometimes I think politics, or at least those who are interested in politics, as I imagine we all are, would seek to reach for politics as a sort of ideological alibi for deeper problems. If only we had socialists or socialism, then I wouldn't feel so shitty, Or as I remember discussing when I was in the U.S. while Bernie Sanders' campaign still presented some hope, that if Bernie wins, then all these psychological problems that I have will be gone, or that and that's a vulgarization of the way that it
All the
was
psychological
put.
problems that you have,
That I have, yeah.
that's putting a lot of weight on
Exactly.
on
But
Mr. Sanders.
again, I'm vulgarizing what was said, but to a certain extent, it's like, oh, well, we have all these problems of social atomization. We have these problems of social breakdown, blah, blah, blah. But if only Bernie becomes the Democratic candidate and even becomes president, then, all these problems will begin to start to be resolved. And, that places way too much pressure on what a U.S. president can do absent of wider social movement. And at the very least, taking loads of congressional seats, let alone carrying through a real project of political transformation. So anyway, all that to say is that sometimes this can work as a bit of an ideological alibi for pre-political problems. Or to put it, and to be a little bit Donald Rumsfeld here, you can have pre-political problems that have pre-political solutions. You can have political problems that have political solutions. But then you can also have pre-political problems that have political solutions and political problems that have pre-political solutions, right? So to take the example of something which would be a pre-political problem that you have a political solution to, you might say that, for example, these problems of authority that you're talking about, the absence of good enough parental authority. Well, it's quite hard to change the way the way people parent. In fact, that is a real problem today. That there's too much political intervention in how people parent, trying to set out the right way to parent, which is often counterproductive because it actually undermines parental authority. So that would then, if you try to find a political solution, would be either through kind of social policy, or maybe you create a political campaign for your party, which tries to strengthen the family in some way through political means. I mean, through economic support to families and whatever, which then you hope will provide the groundwork for doing the pre-political work of being good parents. But alternatively, you can have something which should be a political problem, which you find a pre-political solution to. So the political problem might be the absence of genuine grounded political parties or mass movements. But the reason that doesn't exist, you identify, is because there aren't social clubs. People aren't meeting face to face anymore. And so what you want to do is get people in the bars, in the cinemas, in social clubs and sports clubs, i.e. a pre-political solution to what is a political problem, the absence of a political party. And I think that's sometimes a useful way to think about these things, but I think it can also, as I say, be a sort of an ideological alibi, right? So you go, well, there's all these there's these problems with authority, there's a problem with self-medicalization, with over-medicalization, and if only we had political authority or political parties or something like along the way George was describing, that would solve the problem. And for me, there's a mediating link missing there.
Go ahead.
No, I think it's a really kind of good way to put it. Like, and it raises the question, I think, which of our political problems have pre-political solutions, which is a really big question. But I think, or at least my take on this would be that there are two really significant sorts of pre-political problems that we face today, and one of them is this question of, as you said, Alex, of like, I guess, yeah, social clubs, or just like generally being so atomized, and that is a kind of, sociological problem, to put it that way. But I think there is also a question of subjectivity, and I think this is at least one of the things that one of the reasons why I wanted to write this piece is that I do think the idea of alienation, if that's how we understand our contemporary damage, or the damage to ourselves, that that has a kind of an action, or kind of let's take control collectively, as the solution to it. But maybe the reality is today that we have the sorts of subjects produced who are not that well suited to politics because of that inherent illness, inherent victim, inherent weakness, that kind of like inability to act, or kind of worrying about acting due to kind of some very serious damage. And I think that becomes its own kind of material force. Maybe that might not be the right way to put it, but it does, that's where the kind of the dialectic of decay becomes internalized. The kind of all these institutions which gave us collective power, we then come to see that powerlessness in ourselves as well. And that would be, very big pre-political problem. Very, very problematic. Very
Their
bad.
presence is their absence, basically, right?
Yeah. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Amber. We should, this is getting towards the kind of the conclusions of the piece for in terms of the pre-political, but hopefully we're somewhat on the same page.
Very much so. I liked what you said last, Alex, and also what you just said, George. And I suppose it made me think about the issue and the genesis of this damage, issue 5, more generally, trying to tease apart what is the political, narrowly speaking, and how does the pre-political intersect with that. And it's not a simplistic kind of process. It's not, oh, capitalism is making me sick, but neither is it what you commonly see in terms of overdiagnosis, that regardless of whatever's going on in the world, regardless of my parents, it's my job, it's my mental health, and I need to take responsibility for my success in the world and for my own happiness. That actually is not quite right either, in a similar kind of a vein. And I think, pitch for the issue here, the articles really complement each other and kind of draw out different, maybe problematic ways that today we can see politics inserted into pre-political spaces sort of unhelpfully, and the reverse, right? Pre-political issues inserted into political issues. For example, Dustin Gustella's piece on immigration, trying to sort of insert a pre-political kind of moral framework into something very, very narrowly political about like immigration and border control, and also the reverse in Christine Ricky's piece on psychotherapy and trying to sort of render something sort of inherently pre-political, like individual psychotherapy, somehow political. So you get sort of problems in both directions, and there seems to be something really happening in the current moment about a sort of mashup between these two things, right? That I think many of the articles are sort of just trying to draw out and look at and maybe help us think in ideal terms about the kind of healthy pre-political social institutions, collective life, psychological development, parenting, like what does it kind of look like in health that leads to some kind of healthy politics, and how do these things kind of relate to one another in maybe more ideal terms?
No, I think that's a really nice way to put it, that there are problems of, in both directions. And I think it seems to me like politics being inserted into pre-political spaces is a characteristic of woke, whatever that is, or was,
hyper politics more generally,
or hyper politics. And then the other way around, like pre-political being inserted into the political is like, that's a classic case of moralism. And it's maybe like the division between public and private not being very, very clear. You do have these like this. Maybe it's just that the boundaries of politics are very fuzzy, and it works both. Well, it goes both ways, and it works in neither case, because there isn't a clear delimiting of what it is that what sort of problems are subject to a political solution, because not everything is, of course, as you were saying, Alex. And if you think that politics can solve absolutely everything, then you're a dangerous individual. I think it's
well, at the very least, you'll just end up burnt out. Yeah,
that's the best case scenario.
But also, if you don't think politics can solve anything, then that's a problem too, right?
Yeah, you're either a dangerous person whose best case scenario is burnt out, or you're apathetic, who's the person who's probably in a very bad vibes. But yeah, I guess this is part of. Sorry, go on.
Well, no, I think there's. I mean, at the risk of being a little bit meta about this, there is a tendency that when there is politics going on, right, and I think about the period from 2015 to 2019, for instance, the tendency was to, in a disciplinary sense, in terms of academic discipline, to turn to political science, especially, and maybe a bit of political theory, but especially political science. Look at, what are these movements composed of? Who is on the streets protesting? What are their demands? What organizations are they forming? How are they structured, etc. And when political hopes are low, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of options on the table of any sort at all, which would be in many ways our condition now, the tendency is to turn sociological indeed, and sometimes psychoanalytic, perhaps philosophical, where you're like, okay, well, look, actually, what we have is a raised earth. Everything, the catastrophe has already happened. There's nothing out there. We need to really go deep and look sociologically at what is going on. Indeed, look at the pre-political to try to understand what's what are and I think maybe I'm repeating what you guys have just been saying, but I guess you have to ward against both tendencies, to look exclusively into the deep interstices of human sociability to try to find the problems, because in a way that can be immobilizing, because you can't see any more political solutions anymore, because everything is too riven or broken by the crises of modernity, and we can't act anymore. And then the alternative as well is to buy into the hopium, buy into we're going to just do politics, and if only you can get Bernie Sanders elected president, then everything is then thereby resolved. So I guess there's an argument for having a bit of both. No, I hate when people say that because
Yeah. No,
it's wishy-washy. But
no, I think no, it's not. We don't need a bit of both. I think the whole or the way that I understand what we're trying to do in the piece, or in addressing the question of the pre-political, is pre-political. It's like, what is it that subjects need to bring to politics in order, for politics not to be good, but to work or in some way or other. And I think, it's not, and I should be really clear, it's not having the right ideas. It's not, I mean, this is obvious, presumably, but like, it's not indoctrinating the kids with having the right ideas about this thing or that thing. I think, Amber said earlier about kind of neurosis and unhappiness. And I think it is important that the miserable neurotic will find it much more difficult to be a political citizen than the ordinary unhappy guy or gal. There is like some question of what it is to be a citizen that is that, and it's easier to do that if the self-conception of citizens is that, yes, we're not expecting politics to solve all of our problems, but we're not expecting it to solve none. So there is some, I think, to go back to this idea of what sort of subjects do we want for politics. This is why it's, I think, important to be kind of a bit skeptical of this kind of the overdominance of the biomedical model, but also not to reject the suffering, because if you do either one of those two things, then you're not going to be producing the sort of people who are going to be willing and able to participate in kind of democratic contestation. I don't know. I saw both of the two of you were with me when I started, but then feel like not necessarily where I landed.
Can I just throw something? Yeah. Can I just throw something at George? But Amber, feel free to jump in and kind of response to it. But isn't there a problem then that you end up turning the object of politics, the subject, right? So that you're basically just worried about creating the right kind of people to then do politics, right? And that when it's done by the state, of course, we don't like that. That's, because it's interventionist and creepy and behavior management and so on. But are we not just kind of proposing the same thing from bottom up? And is that right? Is that we,
I have an answer to this, but I know there was some, we haven't really talked about kind of, I don't know if we want to talk about super ego development or not, but I don't know if this is the right place to do it.
As good a place as any, but do you want to respond to Alex first?
Yeah, I mean, it's not about creating the right sort of people. It's about not creating the wrong sort of people. If that is, if you're buying one, I'm selling it.
I'm not sure if that. Yeah, maybe it's evasive, but I kind of
point,
also agree
because it isn't. I mean, I think that is creating the new man in the Leninist model, or the kind of, here are the people who agree with everything that the state mandated or ideology requires. That is, no, it's not that. But it's, to go back to the education episode, it's about a base level of literacy, so that you can read a newspaper, if listeners remember what those were once upon a time, so that the political discussions and conversations of the nation can be, you can participate in those. And it's, feeling, I guess it's essentially like feeling able to advocate for your own interests, being able to be part of a group. Let's leave it at that kind of vague level. That's what political subjects need. And it's not about having the right ideas, to just repeat that point, which may be unnecessary now, but so it's about not saying you are excused from being political, like a citizen, on the basis of not being competent or able. And then maybe that's an extreme kind of like end of the kind of medicalization or over medicalization trajectory. But I think that's the quote unquote wrong sort of person, and not because of anything in them inherently, but because of how the self-conception is advanced. I don't know.
Amber?
You kind of put me on the spot there. That was the best I could do.
Oh dear. Well, I suppose the superego is a psychoanalytic concept, and it is the way we internalize, in part, authority. And to develop in health, in a psychoanalytic model, we have to come into contact with a good enough authority to develop a good enough superego for ourselves. Something like this. And we already touched on this in such a simplistic way. And I think it's worth saying, when you talk about psychoanalysis, it's always sort of both literal in some sense, but also metaphorical. But early on, you have this kind of symbiotic merging a relationship between the baby and the mother. And it's this world in which the baby perceives the mother and the breast as sort of existing in a gratifying, solipsistic kind of a way for the child. And at a certain point, the father introduces the symbolic, the rule of the law, like the name of the father is this kind of phenomenon that interrupts the state of bliss, and there's a bit of distress involved with that. Rules begin to happen. You can't do this. You must do this. Your mother does not just exist for you. She actually is more partnered with me. And that is the kind of origin of the superego. And in that kind of infantile phase, the superego is at once kind of moralistic or punitive, right? It kind of can be very harsh and black and white to kind of get the rules, but also a bit rebellious and wants the exceptions to the rule, or hasn't really internalized it. But over the course of healthy development, you sort of internalize it a bit more and sit with it and maybe push back, and a good enough authority is receptive to some of the things that you reject or want to modify, and you start to kind of take it on for yourself and develop a superego that is firm but flexible and can marshal a lot of context in any given different kind of situation, and understand that ethics is infinitely kind of complex and variable, and world of competing goods, and we're sort of navigating the world with a superego that is, part our own, part a reflection of the world that we're living in. It is kind of social. The superego is a kind of messenger from the social, but we kind of make it our own and can act in the world in some kind of ethical manner that but it connects to development in psychoanalytic terms. That
And I
was a bit of a
think
tangent.
no. Sorry, I kind of I asked you about. I don't think it's a tangent at all. I think it's the again, it's this question of like subject formation and the processes to go through to avoid the kind of either the infantile kind of fantasy of being able to solve everything through politics or through kind of omnipotence of some sort, and then a kind of a stunted development as well. And I think like this is to kind of link it back to some of the things which we like, some of the lash that we have in the piece, or maybe this is like Hannah Arendt's point, although she doesn't have, not all of her points are correct. There is something about socialization being a kind of collective responsibility, and I think this is not really one that we seem to be kind of picking up at the moment collectively, because it is the question of how you set these processes in place so that you can have mature subjects, ones who avoid some of the pitfalls of kind of pathological super ego formation. And that doesn't seem to me to be the situation necessarily that we're in, where we have these processes working well and the sorts of political subjects created that we would need for politics. Anyway, I mean, I don't want to kind of belabor this point, but I think that's what the pre-political like lens can usefully kind of get us to look at, is that these kind of long-standing political processes, I think, are coming home to roost in terms of what subjects are now being created. That sounds a
Yeah,
bit
I mean,
down.
no, but I mean, and also, we would, I think we would probably agree that, to a certain extent, the political challenge today is around, I would say, maybe 70-30 between the subjective and the objective, which is to say the problems of political organization, of even sociability at a deeper level, of political will formation, etc., are the things that face us, maybe are not more important, but are more primary right now than are the objective problems of, for example, the crisis of profitability, about finding new ways of organizing the economy, of democratic planning, and so on. We would like to have those problems, but we have some subjective things which face us perhaps in a more immediate sense. I might split it 70-30. George might have a different ratio
I
to
think
propose.
80-20.
Well, I knew you would do that, but yeah.
71-29.
Yeah. But if you allow me maybe one last comment, and then you can comment on that, and then we'll maybe end this there. Which is, to a certain extent, this is a lot of re-engineering, or excuse me, reverse engineering the New Left. Because if the New Left, in its guise as a movement which is concerned with the pre-political in some ways as well, sought to undo traditional authority for liberatory ends, to perhaps experiment with the possibility that we might do away with the repression entirely, and that hasn't quite worked out. And so we're in a process not of wanting to go back to a pre-1960s, pre-New Left sort of era, because I don't think that's even desirable, even if it were possible. But to a certain extent, reversing part of it as a means to go forward. But I think at the same time, we also have to deal with the reality that we cannot have the subjects that we desire or we think are the right ones for politics. To a certain extent, you have to deal with the subjects, the political subjects, as we find ourselves, and we include ourselves in this as well. We can't obviously just speak about ourselves as political entrepreneurs, which approach society as if it were a distant external object. So, to a certain extent, I think that the sort of the type of damage subject that we encounter today is also the subject that is going to have to act if we're going to have politics. It's not something which is, we can't discover somewhere else the correct subject, and nor can we manufacture the correct subject either. Certainly not. Certainly not entirely, because that would be impossible. So I guess that's where we find ourselves today.
I have a really quick point on this, and then
Yeah.
Amber, you should get the final word as the guest. But reverse engineering the New Left, I don't think that's right, and I think it's because we have the balance. I'm very taken by the balance of subjective and objective problems, Alex, as you set it up, because I think, and listeners can, and I'm sure they will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think that we have more subjective problems than objective problems in that balance than the New Left did. I think that we are defined today by not the external disasters and catastrophes and end of the world, but by the fact that we think that that's true, which is a subjective problem. I don't think that humanity is going to end, and if it does, then nobody's going to be around to say I told you so, and that I was wrong. So it's I can make that prediction quite confidently. But I do think that balance has shifted, and that we are in a more of a subjective trap than an objective
Well, I mean,
danger.
the crisis of politics is itself the tilting of that balance, right? Because if you have the capacity to form a collective subject which can act upon the world and transmit its interests and ideals through to institutions of power, then you're able to steer society in some way. That's what politics and this certainly non-anarchist politics, which is to say most politics, where you're able to seize state power in some sense, is able to steer society and direct it. And so that you're able to confront the objective problems that you have. If you don't have politics, you're dealt the hand of the more primary issue of the subject, of where is the subject for politics, where is the collective subject, where are the organizations that might act, what are the forms of sociability that provide the groundwork for then creating these organizations, and so on. And so I think to talk about the balance between the subjective and the objective, and to say that it's weighted in some measure towards the subjective, is itself to restate the crisis of politics as our primary issue. Amber, but the final word.
Last word. Well, gosh, it's been great to be on the podcast. I think I will end just by being the psychotherapist that I am here and say that look, I think we need authority. And if you, what would I say? It's understandable to have a lot of skepticism about authority because you can always get it wrong and be so damaging. And I think that there's a reluctance to be an authority figure as a therapist, as a parent, as a teacher, all of those things, because you can get it wrong and because it can be so damaging. And, your child grows up to be in therapy complaining about their mother, but it's worth the risk, that we need authorities to internalize and modify and push against and blame and develop in relationship with. And we should seek people outside of ourselves who know more than we do as individuals. And we should, really think about how we're holding our own authority in any roles in which we are an authority of some sort, and understand that that has so much kind of value.
Excellent. That's a great place to leave it and a great final word. Amber, thank you very much for coming on. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you guys have as well. And I hope the listeners will as well. I have a 70-30 confidence that the listeners will enjoy this. All right, we'll leave that here. Thanks very much. Catch you later. Bye-bye.